Charlie Pellet, thank you, and thanks for joining us on the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube. I am not resigning is the line of the day in Washington, courtesy the Speaker of the House. This after he was urged to resign by one of his own, Thomas Massie, the Republican from Kentucky, who is now apparently going to help Marjorie Taylor Greene with a motion to vacate, says it's time to clean the barn. There's a big family meeting, the Republican conference, and that's the kind of language the Speaker was hearing. He did reply today in a conversation with reporters. Here's Mike Johnson.
I am not resigning, and it is, in my view, an absurd notion that someone would bring a vacate motion when we are simply here trying to do our jobs.
From a short time ago, with us now in Washington, Nathan Dean, senior policy analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence, who's running odds on whether this new Frankenstein approach to foreign aid will actually work and whether these bills can pass the House, be stitched back together, brought back to life in the Senate. He's back at the table now. Nathan, great to see you. Time to clean the barn, huh? If you have to say publicly you're not resigning, are you winning?
Yeah, what's your definition of winning here? I mean, the Speaker, Mike Johnson, is going through probably the hardest job in Washington as we speak. Mm-hmm. And look, there are going to be thousands different political calculations and hiccups and roadblocks and stuff that are happening here. And we have a very complex week ahead. But we are saying that we think there's a 60% chance that a Ukraine, Taiwan, Israel funding bill to the tune of around the same package as the Senate has already proposed, which is around $90 billion, can pass sometime in the next few weeks or months. The reason being here is that a majority of lawmakers want this. A majority of lawmakers want to get this off their plate and start getting back to governing and working on other types of legislation in advance of the election. And when it comes to the motion to vacate with Speaker Johnson, just remember, who else do they have on the bench? I mean, obviously, nobody wants to go through a multi-week process of trying to figure out who's going to be the next Speaker of the House in an election year. Certainly President Trump doesn't want this. And so take this to be like, we struggle to say here's how it's going to happen exactly, but you take all the different factors, put them together, just like the Frankenstein, we think it can get done.
So amazing. And he keeps his job in the process?
I mean, I don't think he's going to keep his job much. I mean, I think if Speaker Johnson is, saying I'm going to focus on the future, I think he has to focus until the end of this year. When we have the election, just remember, all this is coming about because we only have a one-person majority in the House right now. Yeah. I mean, you had at one point 5, now we're down to 1. We'll eventually go back to 2. Mm-hmm. So we have to see what the election happens next year. If the Republicans take the House and the margin is still only of just a handful of folks, we're in this situation all over again. Yes, and right. It really depends on who the president is. If things are different, then obviously, Speaker Johnson may have different options or different paths ahead for him.
Well, in the meantime, and of course, remember, Marjorie Taylor Greene said, you bring Ukraine funding to the floor, I'm making this thing live. I'm going to make this a privileged resolution. She has yet to do that, even knowing this is coming this week, which makes us wonder what really happened and what was said at Mar-a-Lago last weekend. But they don't have a lot of time to work with here, and you are running odds on whether these can all pass together. It's leaning toward yes, but not by a lot.
Yeah, so we're at 60%. And for what it's worth, we don't do 50-50 calls.
You don't?
Yes. I mean, if you have a 50-50 call, then when you need calls, you just flip a coin. Yeah. But we're at 60%. Now, I'm not saying 60% this week because that text needs to come out ASAP. Mm-hmm. If they want to have votes on Friday night, you got to give them 72 hours. That text has to be out today. Now, let's just say that if there's any subsequent delays, let's say that a motion to vacate comes through tomorrow or on Thursday, and they decide to just delay the system even further. My question is, when is the ultimate deadline that Ukraine aid has to get done? There's nothing hanging out there. There's no sequester. There's no government funding bill. There's nothing. So this is going to drag on. I mean, it could be May or June before they actually move forward with this. Now, I think it's going to be sooner rather than later just because it feels like the momentum is heading towards a catalyst moment of trying to get something done. Mm-hmm. But just remember, we're confident in this 60%, but we're not confident in terms of timing or how ultimately the path they get
there. So
this
recess they're coming up on this weekend may not be a deadline that gets this done. They go home again and do parades or whatever for the summer. and we're talking about this still in June.
Absolutely. I mean, think about the Israel-Iranian conflict. You know, there were estimates out there that Israel spent around $1.3 billion in missiles and airplanes and fuels and so forth like that.
Yeah.
Now, the supplemental package that's out there is $14 billion, $5.2 billion to replenish a lot of those Israeli-owned missile defense systems. But if you have the national security apparatus telling lawmakers, and I'm just saying what-if scenarios here, if the national security apparatus is telling lawmakers things are going to dial down once and if Israel responds one more time, that could take a little bit of the pressure off to get something done ASAP.
Sure.
You know, so again, it's really difficult to say in terms of the timing of this, but we go back to the fact that the majority of lawmakers want this. The majority of the lawmakers want to get it done so they can go back to other things and other legislation and campaigning. And I think a lot of people are just saying, look, we're tired of this. Let us,
Campaign summer is the real deadline, is what
exactly.
it sounds like here. And that's smart analysis as we spend time with Nathan Dean from Bloomberg Intelligence. The Ukraine money specifically, and I guess the Israel money, we're talking about defense contracting in either case here. You put that together, it's about $74 billion, if I remember correctly. We talk a lot about the defense contractors when you come in here. This provides some certainty, I presume, for shareholders or presumptive investors. But there's also a lot of business going on along the side. Bloomberg cleared a story yesterday about Lockheed with a $17 billion missile replacement deal. They're continuing to churn even as this debate goes on.
Absolutely. And so Will Lee, our defense contractor analyst, and I just put a note on the terminal about 30 minutes ago. And essentially said there are 4 names that you need to watch in all of this.
Okay.
When it comes to Ukraine funding, it's RTX and General Dynamics. The reason being is the bulk of the Ukraine funding goes back to weapons and munitions. It's either directly giving those weapons to Ukraine or replenishing the U.S. industrial base of weapons that we've already given to Ukraine. Those 2 names are the ones that are actually better positioned.
These are the older fashioned munitions. We're talking about artillery shells and
Correct.
so forth, right?
Yep.
And General Dynamics is making that kind of stuff. Raytheon air defense missiles, or what more specifically?
Yeah, so I mean, specifically when it comes to the Ukraine, those 2 names, and Raytheon is certainly, I mean, look, all the defense contractors are going to get somewhat of a little bit of relief. And if this package goes through, we're estimating around 1% to 2% sales growth over the next few years. Okay. When it comes to Israel, the Israeli aid that's part of this package isn't all that much. It's around $14 billion, spread them out. A lot of it does go to this Israeli missile defense system, but the more important thing is just the general Israeli-Iranian conflict. Israel has a desire to purchase 50 F-15 fighters, potentially some F-35 fighters. And if you take all that into account, that's about $18 billion that Boeing and Lockheed Martin are the best positioned to capture that. So, you know, this is going to be an interesting year for the defense contractor industry because we had uncertainty at the beginning of the year because of the funding fights. That certainty is now then put there, at least through September of this year. We'll have another funding issue later this year. Sure. But if this Ukraine-Israeli-Taiwan package can get through, the defense contracting stocks at least will know for the next general 4 or 5 years, a lot of this 1% to 2% revenue gains can help them.
Which is much longer term certainty than investors tend to get with defense contractors. Right? A very cyclical kind of a thing that has a lot to do with politics.
Yeah, and also just remember the government contracting process doesn't move. Like Washington doesn't move quickly.
Right.
And so when these bills pass and they say, okay, right, I'm going to give you $100 million to go spend, it's usually an 18 months to 24 months. So when we help clients with their modeling perspectives, for example, it's usually around that 18 to 24 months until the actual dollar amount goes from the president's desk to hitting these companies. And in some cases, you know, it goes even further.
This is really fascinating in that we've talked about the potential for Israeli funding to jeopardize Ukraine funding. It was the opposite at one point. Israel was almost the sweetener to get Ukraine across the finish line. Does Mike Johnson end up looking like the smartest guy in the room at some point by separating these, letting Democrats carry one, Republicans carry the other, then stitch it together?
So I think what Speaker Johnson has done extremely well is kept options open. You know, he's never moving fast. You know, when he came back from the recess, he said, we're going to do Ukraine aid right away.
Yeah.
You know, it's not exactly that. When the last 2-week recess prior to then coming back, he and his allies most likely spent time trying to figure out how could we get President Trump to cover us. They have the press conference at Mar-a-Lago where President Trump comes out and says, I voiced support for the zero interest loan to Ukraine. Or we go for the Repo Act, which is around $8 to $10 billion of Russian oligarch money that you can use to offset some of the spending. And so I'm not saying that the Trump shield, if you will, is going to save him going forward, but there's a lot of patience here. And so if I'm trying to be optimistic about the future, until they actually have to get backed into political walls, they're always going to be looking for options. They're always going to be floating their ideas. And I do think that there's going to be some idea generation going on between Republicans and Democrats on how they can get this forward. Because ultimately, anything that happens, it's got to have the support of Hakeem Jeffries, and it's got to have support of the House Democrats.
Fascinating. Great analysis. As always, this is why terminal subscribers count on Nathan Dean. He's got 60% odds on the whole package. Analysis from Bloomberg Intelligence. Great to see you back, as always. Another seminar with Nathan Dean on